Hey, welcome to Life with Herpes. I am your podcast host. I combine that word, Alexandra Harbushka. I'm founder of Life with Herpes. And it has been a minute since we've had a guest on the show. So, as you know, if you've been following along, there's been a series where we had lots of guests, and we have series where they're just kind of more one-off type of podcasts. But I'm really, really excited to have our guest today. So we have Elisabeth Kristof. And as we've just been talking prior to hitting record on our podcast here, we were just talking a little bit about the nervous system and nervous system health. And we're going to get into this extremely detailed. Elisabeth is a nervous system health and resilience coach. She is a neurology practitioner, and she is the founder of Brain-Based Wellness. So basically, if you are new to herpes, you may not know how our nervous system and our emotions impact our outbreaks. If you've been following along, if you've been on the journey with me for a while, you know this is something I talk about a lot and have gotten definitely into this topic the more that I've learned to work with it in my nervous system and trying to calm it down. So I'm just going to turn the page over here to Elisabeth, who is the expert. So let's open up. First of all, where are you joining us from?
I'm in Austin, Texas. It's still very hot here, so I'm trying to stay cool and kicking it here in Texas.
All right. I'm in Las Vegas, so it's also really hot here. I'm deciding that it is fall because we're only going to be like 88 degrees. So I'm in it as well, just like you.
Totally.
So Elisabeth, can we go back and kind of talk about your journey and how you got to this spot of wanting to talk about our neurological system and how that has to do with our emotions. I'm sure you got here through your own journey. And so let's hear about it.
Okay. Well, I became an applied neurology practitioner in like around 2007. And I really started practicing applied neurology because I had some movement studios here in Austin, and we were doing a teacher training for Pilates. And I knew that the nervous system and brain health was at the forefront of movement science. And so I really wanted to include that in the training, and got certified in applied neurology and started learning in this institute and just fell in love with it and went down a long road of education in applied neurology and used it really primarily for athletic performance and pain management for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then my life hit one of those times where, the floor just kind of falls out from underneath you. And I was under a really high stress load. So lost the business. We were under a ton of financial pressure. That had been my community for 12 years. And so I was dealing with all of that stress. And then at the same time, my partner that I lived with at the time was diagnosed with a rare cancer around his heart. And I went into being a full-time caretaker for him as well, and going through that whole aspect of the medical system. And I started to experience some really severe outputs of my own nervous system. I was dissociating a lot. I was throwing up all the time. I have autoimmune, so I was getting sick.
And how old were you at this time?
At that time, it was probably around 2018. So I'm 41 now. I was in my late 30s.
Right. And that's really young to be experiencing these things. Too young. I mean, we shouldn't experience them to begin with, but especially in your 30s.
Yeah, totally. And he was also in his late 30s. He was 39 when he was diagnosed with the cancer. And we were healthy. Like, neither of us drank. We worked out. We ate well. And so I went on this deep dive of trying to understand what was happening to him. And that is what led me to understand quite a bit of the work that I do now, because I started looking into somatics, and he had a lot of childhood trauma. And so I started reading books like Waking the Tiger and The Body Keeps the Score, and seeing this huge link between adverse childhood experiences and health outcomes later in life. And I also had all of this background in applied neuro. And so I could really watch him in these times and see him experiencing outputs of his nervous system, watching his eye movements and the way his posture changed and vocal tone. And then as I was reading these books, I didn't just see him, I saw myself too. And under this time of high stress, a lot of my own unresolved childhood trauma came flooding back to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of my health outcomes started to make sense. My autoimmune and my alcoholism. I was a sober alcoholic. And I also saw, as I was experiencing this high stress, my nervous system going into a lot of protective modes. My binge eating got really bad, migraines, pain, shutdown, dissociation. And I just started connecting all of these dots between the dysregulation that occurs when we're little kiddos going under periods of high stress and how that impacts our development, and how our nervous system then is driving so much of our life experience, not just in terms of like pain and athletic performance, but in terms of our behavior, our bigger health outcomes, our emotional experience, our relationship capacity. And that was when I really started to take all these tools of applied neurology and begin to apply them to trauma resolution and behavior change and stress management, as well as emotional resilience.
I am so glad that we are talking about this, because as you're talking, I had 5 million things pop up in my mind. But as I'm sure you know, and many of us listening, is we may have experienced something here or something there that you just shared. And you go to your doctor and you say, I don't know what's wrong. I just don't feel right. I just, I have a hard time getting out of bed. Or like you said, I'm dealing with this, or I'm throwing up, or I just whatever. And you would go to your doctor, and I'm not downplaying doctors by any means. I am not. I am very grateful that we have doctors. But what I'm saying is, we go and we say, I have this problem. And the answer is, well, maybe you need more sleep, or you just have stress right now. So let's just work on some stress management. And maybe here's a pill, or you can try this, and there's really nothing we can do, is really what it sounds like for a lot of us. And I know a lot of people, when we're diagnosed with herpes, that's the message we get. Just listening to your story as well. When I was in my early 30s, I couldn't get out of bed. Like, just, it was hard. Or sometimes I would, and I would have to go back to bed. Like, I couldn't do it. And it was my thyroid. Why is an early 30-year-old having hypothyroid? Like, there was no reason for it, just like you're saying. And explaining all these things. And I've worked through it and worked through it and worked through it. We're trying, like you said, every time you get to one spot, you're like, oh, let's go deeper over here. And you're like, I was fine here. I was fine figuring out this level of it.
Yeah.
So can you explain when trauma hits? We talk about trauma a lot. I call it personal 9/11s, right? We have our own traumatic event, and this can be everybody's level of trauma. It can be different. It doesn't matter. It's how it affects that individual person. So specifically talking about a herpes diagnosis, when we are diagnosed, it is basically the most suffocating event that somebody can go through. Well, I'll speak for myself on this, because it is attached to a stigma that defines you as immoral, no longer you're used goods, and you are a dirty person now for life. And those stigmas just absolutely pierce our confidence, pierce our outlook, and we're left with the stigma and the shame of I'm unlovable. How does that traumatic event play over to the nervous system?
Well, we are social animals. We are wired for social connection. And I think it's really important that people understand that's not just a cognitive need or experience. Like, physiologically, at the level of our nervous system and our biology, we have evolved to be in sync with other people's nervous systems. We need other nervous systems for co-regulation, for healthy emotional expression. And then also, throughout our human history, we need to be in tribes for protection against predators, for reproduction. So it's deeply baked into our nervous system, which is our operating system, that we need to maintain our social bonds. And when we experience things that threaten to sever those social bonds, it is very dysregulating to the nervous system. It's a big threat, and it is actually a survival threat. Alienation and removal from the herd is really scary at the level of our survival mind. And so when we experience these things that bring about that primal fear of rejection, of shame, of alienation, it makes a big imprint on our nervous system. And too, for many of us, this isn't the first time we've faced that survival need of social isolation. It happens a lot in childhood. I think really at its root, complex PTSD is an attachment wound. It's an attachment disorder when we aren't getting our social needs met as young developing beings. And so we don't have the co-regulation that we need from our primary caregivers. We don't have people there to help us with healthy emotional expression. And this creates this really high stress load that is very dysregulating to a young developing nervous system. And then it gets all skewed when we form relationships later in life. And so there's a lot that can be compounded there in that moment of diagnosis. It can recreate that trauma response, that trigger of all of those big emotions too inside the body that were experienced in childhood as well.
So yeah, 45 questions just came up there. But so if something traumatic happens, the body remembers it, correct?
The body, the brain, and the nervous system, really.
Oh.
So the way that trauma works is it's never just the event, right? It can be like a big T trauma event or a series of little events that cause stress over time. But what trauma really is it's the re-experiencing of that event later in life, in the way that our brain functions, in the way that our nervous system functions, like the physical state we go to inside of ourselves. And so in that way, like trauma really lives in the now. The event happened in the past, but trauma is how our unique neuromatrix has been shaped to move us into threat response in certain situations that create, elevated heart rate or take us out of a rest and digest state and bring us into that sympathetic, really activated state. And all of these things are happening in our body. When that happens, our hormones change, our homeostasis changes, our heart rate, our blood pressure, the amount of tension we carry in our muscles. And so it's really happening then. Mm-hmm. The event isn't happening, but the reaction inside it's real. It's really happening. Mm-hmm.
So for example, you could have something happen to you as a child, let's say, and then it could be a little hiccup as an adult that just puts you back into that state. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. So we have the way that our brains function is through a system called neurotags. And that means a bunch of different inputs are linked together. It's this idea that neurons that fire together wire together. So all these different data points of sensory input get linked together. And when there's enough of those little data points that reminds your brain, your nervous system, and your body of a past event, the whole neurotag is activated, right? Mm-hmm. So the whole thing comes up, and that includes the response. So it might be something as simple as we're having a discussion with our partner and they have a certain vocal tone that reminds us of an unsafe situation with a partner in the past or with our parents, or maybe they set their keys down a certain way. There's all these social cues that can trigger these. And then what happens is our brain perceives that as threat, and our amygdala maybe thinks this is threatening. And so all of our fuel and our activation go to our brainstem into a survival response, into fight, flight, or maybe we freeze or we flop, we dissociate, and we really lose our higher order thinking systems at that point, and we're moving into a survival state. And it's just the patterned response to those sensory inputs happening inside of our body.
Wow. So I talk a lot about when we're diagnosed with herpes, we do go into we go into the fight, flight, freeze, and you're saying flop. And I talk a lot about, that's our only way of coping with our diagnosis because we are alone. We can't talk about it. It's a stigma. It's something that is shameful. I can't go open up to somebody about this because now they'll know I'll have it. And then what if they tell people? And then that's a whole nother waterfall effect. So I talk a lot about, the fighter. This is the person that either wants to go fight the person they got herpes from, or they want to go fight the cause. We have the person that's the flight that disassociates with their body. That's like, they usually turn to drugs or alcohol. They don't want to disclose. They just say, I don't have it. I can't deal with it. And they don't typically disclose to partners a lot of times. And the flight person goes the opposite, and they become very disassociated with relationships, and they just get into multiple one night stand type of relationships. And then you have the freezer that is like, all I can do is get up, go to bed, get up, go to work, come home, eat something, pop it in the microwave, and go to bed. Like I can't open my curtains. I can't go to yoga. I can't go out with friends. And so can you elaborate a little bit more on those phases and how this is a natural response, but really, like you were saying, how this has a huge impact on, well, I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah. So all of those responses are totally normal and natural protective responses of our brain when it is experiencing stress, a big threat. And so it is important to remember that that is really our brain and our nervous system's best way of keeping us alive in that moment, right? So it really is our body trying to protect us, and that the threat does not have to be a physical threat, right? It can absolutely be an emotional threat, a social threat, or a threat that reminds you of a past threat, like we were talking about before, that trigger that activates the neurotag.
Like you said, someone dropping their keys a certain way could remind you of something that trauma.
And that in that moment, our brain is going to go down the pathway. Which of the F's it chooses just kind of depends on our past experience and our unique nervous system. It's going to choose the thing that it thinks is most adaptive based on past experience. So if we've had success moving into a fight response and that kept us alive, then our brain's going to be like, great. When it feels that stressor, that's going to be the more well-worn path to go down. If we're someone who feels like fleeing the situation is going to be the best response, then that's the path our brain usually takes. When we're completely overwhelmed, then we go into freeze or to flop or tonic immobility. And a lot of that is based on what we experienced earlier in life. And so freeze response, for instance, is a very normal response for children, because freeze response usually happens when there's no escape, when you can't fight off the predator and you can't run away. And so the most adaptive thing to do is to dissociate, to flop, to go limp, or to try to placate your predator with fawning. And so children, they can't usually escape their situation or fight off the predator. So you see that in a lot with childhood trauma. And then that becomes the well-worn path. Even though now I'm an adult and I could certainly escape a situation or fight my way out, that's not what was baked in as my body's go-to trauma response.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of a heavy thing to think about, that it's like replaying that that kind of helplessness of
Uh-huh.
childhood when we get triggered. And then also too, like you said, this drives a lot of our behavior, right? Like you want to go fight the person that gave you herpes, or you want to just run and keep running from the whole situation, because inside it feels like that's the right thing to do. Our body is preparing us to run or to fight. We feel all those sensations of muscle contraction and heart rate speeding up and respiration speeding up. And these are all deep cues inside of us from our body speaking up to our brain that that's what we need to be doing. And so we start unconsciously, this is all at the level of our autonomic nervous system. It's our subconscious mind that is doing this. And so a lot of times people don't have the awareness, like I'm in this stress response and now I'm engaging in this behavior. That takes a little bit of time and altitude, but it is there. It's underneath the surface, driving the patterns of our behavior, because it's what feels like we need to be doing it. It's how it feels inside.
The only way we know how to do it. So what happens if we stay in this heightened alert? What if we stay in this trauma?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not great, because stress is at the root of somewhere between 75 to 90% of all disease, and depending on which study you look at. And what happens when we stay in these really high stress states is we get a lot of stress hormones pumping through our body all the time, adrenaline and cortisol, and a little bit of stress is fine. Like we need some stress for adaptation, and our body's meant to process that through, and then we adapt to it, and we maybe get stronger or, adapt in a positive way. Mm-hmm. But when we don't get the rest and the recovery that our body needs to be able to make a healthy adaptation, and we just stay in that high stress state, then we have cortisol, which can damage our blood vessels. It can damage our nerves. It has all kinds of ramifications on our digestion, because we're moving out of a state where we can digest our food. All the blood is leaving our digestive organs all the time. And our immune system, our nervous system is what controls our immune response. And so if our immune system is left in that elevated state all of the time, it can either start to deteriorate where it can't fight off infection, and you would experience more outbreaks during that time. And it can also show up as autoimmune, where the immune system is too reactive to too much, because it's just constantly getting that signal of I'm about to either fight or run and I might get injured. So the immune system is supposed to be going in that situation, so that if you do get injured, you get inflammation. That's how your body heals if you were to get wounded. So your inflammation is ramped up. But again, that's fine if you're just doing it in that little moment. But if it stays like that all of the time, then your body's in a disease state.
Wow. This is so disturbing. This is also extremely enlightening. Because I feel that we can speak as Americans, that is what we've been taught, is just go, 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 work, 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 get up, work, keep going, push through it. You can do it. Have another cup of coffee. It's 3:00. Go get your espresso, and let's just go, 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 go. And that go, 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 go also keeps you, I'm assuming you're the expert here, in that heightened, cortisol draining, adrenal pumping state.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are sick. We're sick because of it. And it can feel really unsafe to try to go against that paradigm. And especially if we have a lot of trauma and or built up stress over time, we are in those states of heightened activation and a flight state. And so it feels really uncomfortable to try to stop and slow down and rest when we're in that elevated state. And we can also get really used to being in that state. Our body likes to maintain homeostasis. And so if we've been in that state for a long time, that's what's predictable to our brain. That's the hormone levels that our body is just used to. And our brain really likes predictability. It functions on pattern recognition to keep us alive. And so, yeah, we can get stuck in a place that's harmful to our long-term health.
So very interesting to hear this, because I'm thinking back as you're speaking. So in my 20s, I thrived off of that adrenaline. I loved it. And the reason why I loved it is because I thought that with my adrenalines going, I would be thinner. Right. So if I kept in that state, then it would speed up my metabolism. And I dealt a lot with dealing with my weight. It was a very yo-yo time. Not just dealing with that. And so I can remember that's why I would like, not probably why I craved coffee, because I was addicted to coffee, but I would want to keep that caffeine buzz going, because that kept me in that feeling of heightened, like amped, that amped feeling. And I was like that definitely through my 20s. I mean, starting in my late teens, starting in college, late teens, through my 20s.
Yeah. And then you had a crash, right?
Of course.
Didn't you say you had the time in your 30s where you were, I mean, it's just not sustainable for our system. We have the system that really responds to stress is our HPA axis. And it's our hypothalamus communicating with our pituitary gland, which secretes all of these hormones and creates the stress response. And when that is charged up all of the time and all those chemicals are pumping through the body, first of all, too much cortisol actually leads to weight gain and other problems with our thyroid and with our hormone balance in general. And so it's not a sustainable way to live. And it can also be quite challenging to move out of those patterns. And unfortunately, the way many of us end up doing it is because we face some kind of crash or health consequence, or, our body will eventually put the brakes on in a really loud way if we can't find a way to listen to the softer signals of our body first, that like things are not going well. Then a lot of times it takes that big moment to make us start to understand that this is not sustainable.
Absolutely. And that's what I talk about a lot with being diagnosed with herpes, is there were probably little messages along the way for you to say, hey, let's change this, or let's take this path instead, or let's make a different choice here, or let's do that. And you're over there like, no, I get it. I got it. I know what I'm doing. I'm in charge. I'm not going to listen to this little message over here. And finally you get herpes and you're like, okay, I'll listen. I got it. I'll change. Or usually there, again, if you're dealing with the flight response, it may take a while to respond to it. But typically when I speak to people, whether it's day one of diagnosis, 10 years into a diagnosis, is when they're ready to hear that message and ready to make that change. Yeah. And they realize that this journey was not something they needed to go through, but it was life or death for them to go through. They had to go through this journey in order to become who they are supposed to become, in order to deal with their beliefs, in order to deal with other issues in their life. Herpes is just, it's like a facade. It's not really the issue. It's not the issue. There's so many deep rooted core beliefs that are really what is the driving issue with their outbreaks, with their relationships, with how they view their self-worth, with all those things. And from what we're talking about is this, they're one and the same, the nervous system and being diagnosed with herpes and adrenaline, and it's the same thing.
Totally. I think it's really a beautiful place when you can have that perspective of, what is the experience and also my body teaching me in this moment, and how can I use it to live a life that's more in alignment with my health, my nervous system regulation. I mean, I wouldn't wish anyone to go through the time where I went through, where I was having all of those really severe outputs, or have autoimmune, or have someone you love diagnosed with cancer, all of these things. But at the same time, I wouldn't know any of the things that I know had I not gone through that experience. I mean, it was the catalyst for so much deep understanding, and being able to see so much about the nervous system and our health. And so I think it's really beautiful that you have the ability to take the experience and learn and find meaning.
And start to dissect it.
Yeah.
And similar to what you were talking about earlier on, is there might be some underlying traumatic event that you may not even realize. You may not even realize that's what's propelling you going forward. How you discovered that with a past partner, that there was some traumatic childhood events that happened, and that's what propelled it 25, 30 years later.
Yeah, it's such a moment when you start to learn about, you know, adverse childhood experiences, or even just, you know, not everyone has to have, like, my ACE score is 6. Not everyone has an ACE score of 6, to have things in the background of your life that are driving your behavior and remembered in your body. And when you start to connect those dots, you know, part of me was very, it was shocking to learn and remember some of that stuff. And there was another part of me that was really relieved, like, oh my God, so much makes sense. I get it now. Like, I get it why I was, like, diagnosed with these mental health things when I was younger. I understand my addiction. I understand my autoimmune. Like, I made so much more sense to myself when I had the context of those experiences. And so it's such a journey to remember and to repattern and to work through all of that. And it also brings this really deep connection to self.
So how do we move through this? How do we move out of heightened state to the Zen state? How do we move all this energy throughout our body? Would probably be, or would that be the next question to ask? Or would the best question to ask be, how do we realize we have trauma in our body? I'll let you, like, what's the phase to kind of move through this? How do we?
So definitely the first phase is awareness. And I tell people, start by looking at your behaviors. You know, if there's things that you can't find yourself being able to move out of, that you don't want anymore, like, why am I doing this? Like, for me, I was a lifelong binge eater, and that went on well after I got sober, and I just couldn't stop. And I realize now that it was a tool that my body was using for self-regulation. It was bringing me down out of that heightened sympathetic activated state into literally a calm and respond, rest and digest state. And it was the most adaptive way my brain had found to give me the regulation that I needed. And it started as a little kid, and that was my nervous system's protective output. And it was keeping me alive in some ways, because it was bringing me out of that high stress state. So, like, follow the behaviors. If there's patterns in your relationships, in your health, in your behavior, that you just feel like you're stuck in, then there's probably a reason. Our nervous system and our brains do have, like, a divine intelligence, and everything our brain is doing is really for our survival underneath. Like, that's the big question that the brain is always asking. Am I safe? What can I do to survive here? And so starting to look at that will lead you back to, if you can question it and look at it with a little bit of curiosity, that might lead you back to some understanding of, like, what's going on. You don't have to remember the trauma. You don't have to know what happened to know that you're dysregulated and to repattern. So I don't ever suggest that people force themselves down the road of, like, retelling and rehashing their trauma, especially if that doesn't feel right. So then the next thing that you would do is just start to work with your nervous system. And that's really what I do through applied neurology. There's lots of ways to work with your nervous system. You can do somatic practices. You can simply spend time moving your body gently, go on a walk out in nature, maybe be barefoot. And then the work that I do is really looking at trying to speak the language of the nervous system directly to the nervous system. So our nervous system doesn't speak like English or Spanish or French. It speaks the language of sensory inputs. So that's sensations coming in through my skin, or information coming in from my eyes, or the balance system in my inner ear, or from inside of my body, my interoceptive system. And what applied neurology really does is work with each person's unique nervous system to help heal deficits in all those different sensory systems, in your eyes, in your balance system, in your body mapping system. And so we teach people on the site on brainbased.com to find their unique deficits in their nervous system, and the stimulus that their brain and their nervous system need to help them self-regulate and feel safe and kind of calm down. And that's going to be a little bit different for everyone. So you're just learning a bunch of different neuro tools that you would use on a daily basis to help train your nervous system, just like you would train in the gym, or just like you brush your teeth every day. You just spend a little bit of time working with your nervous system to start to create more capacity and resilience. And then you also have certain stimulus that your nervous system really responds well to. Like if I give my feet some sensory stimulus and some vibration, my nervous system is like, whew, calm. It needed that particular sensory input to help it regulate. And so you'll learn your own high payoff tools, and then you have those. And when you feel signs of threat, you speak to the language, and you speak to the nervous system in the language it understands with those sensory inputs, and help yourself re-regulate.
That's amazing. I talk about this a lot. Well, I've moved into this significantly this year, talking about trying to. So I'm not a doctor, and I can't recommend, and I can't prescribe, and all this. Dealing with herpes outbreaks, what is prescribed to us by our doctors is, here's a pill, here's the Valtrex, here's valacyclovir. It's the antiviral to get rid of your outbreaks. And does it work? Yeah, it does. It does a great job at that. My whole side of it is, there's other ways. There's something happening in your body. There's some sort of trauma, or some sort of, it's kind of like, you leave your car on overnight, or you leave your lights on and your car's it's just running and it doesn't start the next day, right? There's something else running in the background in our body that is causing us to get herpes outbreaks. And so I've been talking significantly about the nervous system, and doing what we can to calm it, and doing what we can through breath work, doing what we can with grounding, doing what we can with, I've gotten into tapping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do a lot of tapping on Brainbase.
I love tapping.
Yeah, it's great.
Love tapping. Yeah, it's great. And just starting to learn how these things can calm us down, because when we're in that heightened state, like you're the expert here, but our blood is pumping. It's pumping. It's making us stronger. It's making us, how do we run away from danger? We are literally in a stranger danger state. And how do I get out of that? And so our blood's pumping. And then when your blood's pumping and going to all, your legs and all these things, like you described, we can't take care of ourselves. Our immune system can't operate. And that's when we get outbreaks. This is specifically when I get outbreaks, is when I have 100%. A time crunch, or I have something going on. I was in school the last couple of years, and whenever I had homework due, that would be a trigger for me. Like I would, oh, here it is. It's just that adrenaline going.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is definitely for sure that if you have practices to help your nervous system process stress, mm-hmm. and then you work with the nervous system to help it have greater capacity to handle stress without moving into protective outputs, you will have less outbreaks. I mean, there's definitely, our body cannot handle a viral load as well when we are in a high stress state. Our immune system does not function as well. that goes for any type of, if I'm in a high stress state, I'm going to be more likely to have an autoimmune flare up. I'm going to be less resilient if I do accidentally eat some gluten because I have celiac. And whereas if I'm processing my stress and really working with my nervous system, I have more capacity to handle these other stressors without experiencing an output that I don't want.
Yep. I'm like, yep, sign off on that. I'm still dealing with a lot of stomach issues and digestive issues. I've really been working on it the last, I don't know, 3 years. It's made a lot of differences, but it's all because of in my 20s. That was how I operated, and that's how I fueled myself, was off of that. And that's probably why I got herpes. It's probably why my body's like, oh, here we are. Let's just add this one to your list because you need to listen.
I think so many people can relate to that. I mean, myself included too. Just before I lost my business, I was deep in workaholism and hustle and just going all of the time. And it was a movement business. So I was overtraining and then binge eating. And it took life falling apart and my health starting to deteriorate for me to really understand the knowledge that I already had about the nervous system. Like I knew it intellectually,
Right.
but then I had the experience of living those outputs and moving through that time. And I think it is a powerful place to be when we understand how we are wired and what our true capacity really is, and then how to work with the system to increase that capacity, but also to create a life that's more aligned with the health of our operating system, our brain, our nervous system.
Mm-hmm. If somebody is to never hear this message, what is a consequence of not obviously we talk about disease, but what would be the biggest consequence of not hearing this message?
Well, I think disease is the biggest one. But there's all kinds of ways in our behavior that can be really harmful where we are seeking the regulation through our behavior. Like if you drink alcohol, that's a nervous system depressant. It's a way to come down out of that activated state. Most addictions are fueled by trying to create a different feeling inside, and that feeling inside is coming from the state of our nervous system. And so if we want to be able to move out of these quote unquote maladaptive behaviors, and I put that in quotes because in some ways they are protecting us from too much stress for too long. But then they can also, of course, cause more stress and harm to our health and harm to our relationships. So if we want to move out of maladaptive behaviors, we have to have new tools for regulation to allow our nervous system to come down out of these heightened states, or maybe to give it activation that it needs if we're stuck in a freeze state or a flop state. And knowing how to work with it, then we don't have to rely on these external sources to create the regulation and the safety we need. And then it can also have a really big impact on your relationships. Like I said, I believe we are deeply social beings. My nervous system is communicating with your nervous system right now through my vocal tone, my eye movement, my body posture. And we're always communicating with each other across that social synapse. And so if I want to have healthy relationships and move into relationships that are secure attachment style, then I also have to think about working with my nervous system in relationship to make connection safe.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I talk a lot about that too with being diagnosed with herpes. Is like, are you dating the same person with a different face?
So much of those patterns, people talk a lot about attachment style, and that's really just, what my nervous system feels is safe and what is dysregulating, right? If I have anxious attachment and I'm always compromising my own needs for someone else, I have that big fear of abandonment. At a deep root level, it's because it feels more dysregulating and more uncomfortable inside my nervous system, inside my body, to lose that attachment than it does to self-abandon or give up my own needs. And so I'm just doing that behavior, that codependent behavior, as a means to calm down and to re-regulate and to create safety in my nervous system, because it's so threatening to think about that social attachment at a survival need being cut.
Wow. This is just absolutely everything up my alley, and everything that we've really been moving through with Life with Herpes, trying to get people on this journey to a little more self-discovery, to actually making permanent changes in their life that are not just willpower, that are like, oh, I'm gonna, like change. Oh, I'm gonna go to the gym every day and I'm gonna get up and I'm just gonna do it. No, there has to be more of a reason to do this. Let's get to the root, literally the root of our beliefs, and figure out why we're doing this or why we're not doing this. To like you said it beautifully. This has kept us alive up to now, but it doesn't have to keep us alive. We can learn to change it and not need it, not be dependent on it any longer.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is one technique today that someone could do that goes, oh my gosh, I'm in this? What's one thing that he or she could do right now?
So I was thinking about a good tool to offer people, and I think I'm going to go with one that's a little bit mobilizing.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly because you were mentioning the shame that comes with a lot of this, and shame is a really immobilizing emotion. It's really linked with freeze.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also real harmful to our body to stay stuck in that shame state. There's studies that show inflammation linked to shame and social isolation and all these things that we want to move out of. So when people are experiencing a high stress event, and this one seems kind of silly, but one of the best things to do afterwards, or if you start to first recognize those signals, like I'm shutting down a little bit, or I'm activated, but wherever it is, I'm off the kind of normal modulation of my nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have an NSI tool called chicken breathing, and
Okay.
you just stomp your feet and you literally flap your arms like a chicken so that your arms are hitting your rib cage. We want to be getting impact to our bones. So part of our stress response begins in our bones. Our bones secrete a chemical called osteocalcin, and it is actually part of the signal that it's time to move into an activated state or a stress response. And our bones know to stop pumping that out when they get impact, because they feel like we're completing the cycle. So we want to get some impact to our bones, and we want to mobilize some of that energy through. And if we're starting to shut down, getting some movement is really important, because it will help bring fuel and activation to our frontal lobe and help us move out of that shutdown state. So you just stomp your feet, you flap your arms like a chicken, and you take long exhales, and you breathe in and out through your nose only.
Okay.
And you can do that for like 30 seconds to a minute and see how you feel after. So one of the big things in applied neurology is you always want to assess and reassess to make sure that it's something that your nervous system responds well to. So you would test a range of motion, or you could test your vocal tone, or you could even test an exercise. Do the thing and do your chicken breathing, and then reassess and see how your nervous system responds. And also just if you feel better, if your mental clarity comes back, if you feel less panicking or anxiety, less shut down. And it's kind of silly, and you can play some music with it.
I love it.
Go to town.
I love it. And like you said, well, all these little things, a lot of times we just kind of go into this like hunker down mode. And becoming a mom, I have a 3-year-old, and it's completely changed the way I look at things. And it's like, oh, he's just going to go run and he's going to go play. And I'm like, why didn't I think of that? Or I needed to do this, or I needed to go sit out. He loves to sit outside on the grass, and he likes to do it naked. Like, and I'm like, yeah, he's grounding. Okay, we'll do that, and these things sound silly, but it's just the natural way of your body connect. Like, he's obviously more in tune to this is what I need right now. And like you said, the flapping your arms, I mean, I'm sure it's going to be great. I can't wait to try it.
It's fun. It's a fun one. And sometimes this can get kind of heavy, like these topics and this work. And so sometimes it's nice to just have a neuro tool that is like light and fun.
I love it. How can people reach out to you? Because I know that the audience here, I know that our listeners are going to go, oh my gosh, I need this. I need to follow Elisabeth's work. I need to know what she's doing because this is a tool I need to grasp like
So
yesterday.
awesome. I would love to get in touch with everyone. I'm the co-host of a podcast called Trauma Rewired that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. And we take a very deep dive into all these things, the neurology of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, attachment styles. So it's a great free resource to just learn a bunch more. And we love connecting with people there. And then if people are interested in starting to begin that journey of working with their nervous system and creating that daily training and finding some tools, you can get 2 free weeks of live nervous system training on the Brain-Based Wellness site at freeneurotrial.com. And I'm on there live. My facilitators are, everything's recorded, goes on demand the next day. And you can just start to find tools to work directly with your nervous system, start create capacity, process stress. We do emotional processing and EFT tapping on there too.
I love tapping. I started tapping with my son because he would have a hard time going to sleep and it like knocks him out, it's great.
Yeah, it's a great stress processing and it's great for emotional processing too, which is like a whole nother conversation.
We'll get into that. All right. Well, I'm excited for the listeners to reach out to you and just learn. It's a transformation. I mean, I really talk about this whole herpes journey is a transformation to your life. And it is a blessing that this happened because we are going to come out stronger, better, faster, more aware of our environment and just the heavy weight that's on our shoulders. And we have this little reminder that would pop up, which would be an outbreak. And it's just our opportunity to go back and say, I didn't fail. I didn't do anything wrong. It's my body telling me, okay, this is what we're going to do next. It's a little warning.
I love that. It's exactly on the money from a nervous system perspective.
Excellent. If you could leave the listeners with one topic, one thought, one quote, something that just resonates with you right now.
I think just kind of echoing what you were talking about, that, all of these are just all of our behavior, outbreaks, whatever it is, it's just outputs of our nervous system. And when we can start to understand that and look at all of it just with curiosity and like have that dialogue with our body, it does so much to alleviate shame, which is really, really important for our health and our human experience. And so the more you can remember that your body, your brain, your nervous system is just trying to protect you, keep you alive, and try to start to learn to listen to the signals, then the easier it is to create growth and transformation from any experience.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Elisabeth. All of your information will be linked in the show notes and listeners can find you. I feel truly blessed to have spoken to you today and have you as a guest on the podcast. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And
thank you so much for having me. It was really an honor to be here.
You're welcome. I can't wait to see the transformation that people have. So thank you so much.
Thank you.